Thank you, Tara, for inviting me to speak to you. My name is Martin Forde. I am the independent advisor to the Windrush Compensation Scheme. I have been a barrister since 1984, mainly compensation. I don't know a lot about immigration, but compensation scheme demanded a compensation lawyer. And given my heritage, I'm half Bajan, half St. Lucian, I was very, very happy to assist. I was appointed in April 2018, when the scandal broke through the Guardian newspaper and the fantastic work of, well, Amelia Gentleman at the Guardian and May Bullman at the Independent, which revealed that a lot of West Indians had been either deported or threatened with deportation because they didn't have the right documentation. And she collated these cases. I think Paula Wilcox was one of the early ones. A lady who'd worked in the House of Commons and then found herself, I think, being detained in Wolverhampton because she couldn't produce evidence of her arrival in this country. And I was actually following the story quite closely. I'm thinking of writing a letter about it because that's exactly my parents' generation. They came in 53 and 55, just expressing how appalled I was. And I got a phone call to say, would you be prepared to assist in designing a compensation scheme? And I jumped at the chance. So what we did, we had a call for evidence for a month. We got 650 responses, and I was able to identify kind of 14 common themes of ways people had suffered. So obviously the most shocking ones were people had been deported, because people were deported. Then people who'd been detained but hadn't been deported. Some of them had also lost ability to access bank accounts, driving licenses, etc. So there were about 14 different types of loss. So the idea was to design a scheme that would compensate people for those losses, which was a challenge. I think the other two things I would say is that very early on, I indicated to the Home Office that I knew my community sufficiently well to know that, you know, if you affect one person in the family, it affects all. So I insisted that close family members have a claim. So I know that, for instance, in my personal situation, I was very reliant upon my dad for childcare so that I could work. Had he been detained, deported, or been rendered, I don't know how to explain it, so emotionally impacted by the fact that he'd been threatened with deportation that he wanted to stay in his own home and lie low, which was the response of some people, that would have had an impact upon my ability to earn. And so I'd have suffered loss. I wanted to make sure that it's really the Windrush generations, it's not generation. We're all affected by this. And then unfortunately, I also realized that this could potentially be a very elderly cohort, and that by the time the scheme was operational, some people, which unfortunately has been the case, Sarah Connor died on the 16th of September, I think it was 2018. But I've organised the scheme so that, you know, in theory, and I hope her children do come forward, they can claim on an inherited basis the money that she would have got, plus they will have their own claim for watching their mother go through the trauma that she suffered. And I feel fairly vindicated in terms of the design. I think implementation is something we need to be very vigilant about. I watched Sitting in Limbo. I know Anthony Bryan reasonably well. I've met him on a few occasions. And seeing not just what he went through, but what his partner went through, what his children went through, what his grandchildren went through, I felt personally quite gratified that without having an intimate knowledge of that case at the time the scheme was designed, there is provision for his partner, his children and his grandchildren to claim for the emotional impact upon them of seeing him detained and threatened with deportation, and expenses associated with, for instance, things like visiting him, because, you know, I was appalled to see that a man who lived in Edmonton was sent to a detention centre in Dorset, which is, you know, about 150 miles away. And so, you know, there are obviously huge expenses involved in taking time either off work and then using public transport or jumping in a car to take the family to visit him for what seemed to be a very short period of time. So as a scheme, I think the scheme is quite sensitive to every type of loss that people have suffered. There's a discretionary provision for things that we haven't thought about. But I do think implementation and speed of delivery are the two things that the Home Office need to be pressed on.
I mean, we were talking, well, you was mentioning that there were some clear themes of who was affected by the kind of, when they was looking to deport people or whatsoever. And then, what's seen in the news, this idea of the low-hanging fruit. How would you kind of explain that? You know, what are your feelings about that? Because
I have to say, I've searched in vain for that phrase. What I do feel is that this obsession with targets, which we can see is completely irrational. This country's an island and it claims it wants to control its borders. So that's part of the motivation for leaving the EU. Last year, the net migration, non-EU migration to this country was 400,000 and EU migration was 48,000. The 400,000 will comprise highly skilled migrants, because it's very difficult to get in from the Black Commonwealth and SUR, or students from wealthy nations such as China and Asia, who are used to sustain our university education. So this country needs migration. It needs migration to sustain its universities, and it needs migration to sustain its NHS. And I don't think there's anything more fundamental to a nation than health and education. And the politicians need to acknowledge that. For good or ill, we either have an education system that's so poor that we can't produce enough talented people that we have to go scouring the world for them, or we have a system which is so unwilling to produce nurses, road sweepers, factory workers, that we have to import them. So, you know, I think the British need to look at themselves before they look at migration, economic migration. In terms of the themes and the low-hanging fruit, I think one of the problems was that a lot of people came in, and again, this is a lack of cultural sensitivity. A lot of people came here from the Caribbean to see the lie of the land and then sent for their children. Sometimes they had children here and then they got their children from the Caribbean to join them, and that could cause other tensions within families. And those children that came in, some came in on their parents' passports, some came in with landing cards, some were actually brought by agents. So you could have, you know, a village in Jamaica, and there'd be 6 kids whose parents were there, and they'd employ one person to get something from the Jamaican High Commission or the embassy, or sorry, the British High Commission, you know, a stamp card, and these children were not even related to them, and they were allowed to bring them and reunite them with their parents. So it was quite chaotic, as you would expect in terms of migration. It wasn't a nice formal, here's a passport. A lot of their parents hung on to their island identity passports, so Jamaican passports, Bajan passports, Trinidadian passports. Sometimes they would renew them because it was cheaper to do so if they were travelling back and forth, the few that could afford it. And they never thought they needed a British passport, because when they'd left their islands, they were British colonies. What the British did when they gave Caribbean islands independence was that they did so on condition that they reclaimed the citizens that had been born there. But my dad, for instance, didn't get a letter saying, "Dear Mr. Forde, you're now Bajan again," because it got independence in 1966. By then, he'd already been here for 13 years, paying tax and national insurance and doing national service. So he had no reason to think he needed another piece of paper. And I think that certainly from 71, this was a policy, I wouldn't necessarily low-hanging fruit, but it was a policy to discourage black migration from the Commonwealth.
So where are we with it now? What's happening now? Are still people?
Okay, so this is my utterly candid opinion. What you've got to realise about reality and politics is that they are seriously divorced. rightly, the then Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, felt under extreme pressure to announce a scheme. So I was appointed in April 2018. We consulted for a month. So we called for evidence for a month till May. We then consulted until November. Most consultations are 6 months. I asked for an extra month because the community were a bit reticent coming forward. I think a lot of people still genuinely scared that any engagement with me or my processes could lead to deportation. So it took a lot of time to build that kind of reassurance. Then we designed probably December, January, February. Then there were some serious discussions to be had about things such as tax and benefits. I didn't want the scheme to pay you compensation only to find it was taken off you in tax, or it took you off benefits, or you had to spend it to get back on benefits. I wanted it ring fenced. So we had a lot of negotiations with DWP and HMRC, and they gradually and rather grudgingly agreed to that. That took about a month. Home Secretary said to me, I'm going to launch on the 3rd of April. I said, that's fine as a launch, but we don't have an infrastructure. We don't have caseworkers. We don't have an office where people can calculate claims with their laptops and their algorithms and their charts. We haven't trained people to handle compensation claims. So they went ahead anyway, because it was politically expedient so to do. And I know that it took till about October or November to recruit those staff. So a lot of people made applications in May and heard nothing at all for 6 months. First payments made in December, so that's within a month. Not bad. Poorly communicated in that it was £62,000, 36 claimants. The press did the maths and said that means they're receiving under £2,000 each. That, I think, went round the community like wildfire, waste of time applying. They're going to pay you peanuts. It's an insult. What the Home Office were very poor at explaining was that most fell into two categories. They were either repayment of fees, so fees that people had expended trying to naturalise, which they shouldn't have expended, which was easy because it's on the Home Office database, so there's no cross-checking needed. And what I call interim payments, by which I mean, let us say you have a claim for immigration fees, loss of earnings, and detention. Loss of earnings, they'd need to establish that you were employed at the time, what your level of earnings was. They go to HMRC, they make an offer. They say, looks as if you're on 20,000 net, you lost your job, you haven't worked for 4 years, 420s or 80, that's our offer. And you're allowed to come back and say, it's wrong for these reasons. I got overtime or whatever it might be. Detention is based upon a formula that is applied by the High Court, because I thought we can't be less generous than a judge would be if you litigated. So so for instance, if you're detained, you get £500 for the first hour because of the shock of detention. And it drops down to 100, and it drops down over the hours and days on the basis that judges have decided you get used to detention. I'm not sure I agree, but that's the applicable law. Those two claims, the detention, the loss of earnings, will take a bit of working out. So I said, get the fees out the door. So a lot of those payments were actually part payments, not full payment. But that wasn't explained. So the last figures were to the end of May, but I know that they were actually what's been paid to March. So they announced them in May. So you say you get 60,000 in December. We've just got up and running. You've then got January, February, March, which obviously includes the new year. In those 3 months, they paid and what was offered and accepted £362,996.92. They called it 363,000. So 420 was paid in 4 months, which I don't think is too bad for a fledgling scheme. That's 100,000 a month. Again, it's not represented in that way. People said, oh, it's 60 claims, totaling 360,000 odd, that's 6,000 each. No, again, a lot of those were interim payments. Included in that £360,000, I hasten to add, was a payment in excess of £100,000 to one individual, which he was offered and accepted. And I think that that's the message to get across. Apply. your children, your grandchildren, if you were affected, have claims. Might not be huge claims, but, you know, even if it's only £500 because my grandchild saw me upset one day, came in and I was in tears and I was worried and they wouldn't explain what was wrong, that's a ticket to the Caribbean. Go on a family holiday with it, as far as I'm concerned. Difficult to disprove as well. You know, I said to the Home Office, you're going to have to take a lot of these claims on trust. There is another gentleman who's been offered £100,000 plus as an interim payment. So this is what we've calculated, but there's more to come. We've had 1,275 claims received. So it looks as if about 100 have been dealt with. So if you've had 100 claims that have been dealt with, you had £420,000 go out the door, and some of those are part payments. That's not looking too bad. An issue is support for claimants. I would like people to be able to get legal aid. I was told that would need legislation. The Home Office had an existing contract with the Citizens Advice, so they are offering advice on how to complete forms, and they've had about 360 people make claims using the Citizens Advice. Issue there, lack of publicity. I think every Citizens Advice should have a big poster saying we do Windrush claims. I think that you need a decent communications program through our radio stations, media, churches, etc., highlighting CA. I also think that the Home Office needs to be sensitive to the fact that this is a very stoical cohort of people. They find it difficult to talk about feelings. I know what my dad's like. You know, everything could be cured with TCP and ice. He was, you know, his pain threshold on a scale of 1 to 10 was never more than 2 because he saw it as weakness. You've got to coax these stories out to people, and maybe they find it easier talking to somebody who's of the same cultural heritage, which CA can't guarantee. So there's a tender process that's been announced for £500,000. I'll be looking at those tenders in July for community groups to bid for money to advise on compensation. And I'm hoping that that will lead to an upsurge, because these will be trusted people. I mean, even I wasn't trusted. At the beginning, there were rumours going around that if you came to a meeting that I chaired, you know, you could find yourself deported, the vans would be parked outside, etc. So there's a massive trust deficit between the Home Office and our community, which they need to address. I also have no real difficulty in justifying myself and my career. I know I'm very lucky. I'm very proud of my West Indian heritage, but I suspect a lot of people thought, you know, you couldn't be there as a QC unless you were some kind of a sellout, which I quite resent, because I've stayed very true to my roots, and that has cost me at times in terms of career advancement, because I refused to be anybody's protege. And if I was angry and upset about how I was treated, I made sure everybody knew. I didn't always have a middle class reaction to these things. You know, I would say, do not ever speak to me like that again, you know. And I think people would think, well, I didn't think that was threatening particularly, but it could have been interpreted as such. But, you know, I'm not having you stand up in court in front of a judge and suggest that, you know, I haven't understood the law, or I'm misleading the court, or because I won't have my professionalism questioned. If I argue a case, I argue it ethically. And I just felt that certainly early in my career, there were certain barristers that tried to make out that because I was from an unconventional background, that I might not be as trustworthy when it came to dealing with the judiciary. And I had to nip that in the bud, because as I've tried explaining to people about how we're portrayed, I mean, we get longer sentences as a people for drugs offences, although statistically we are less involved in the taking of drugs than the white population. And that's something that just isn't out there. But that is an absolutely undeniable truth. But the media prefer to portray us as criminal and violent, unless we are sports stars or singers. They don't deal with the idea that we could be intellectual. That's a huge problem they seem to have.
Definitely agree with that.
Which I'm sure as a historian you've come across.
Very
You know,
much.
have you probably been to conferences where they ask if, you know, if they treat you as if you should be serving drinks? Or, I mean, I've had that. I've been to legal occasions and people held out their glass and said, "Can you get me another glass of wine?" Dressed like this, because they assume that I'm probably the lead, you know, the head waiter, the maitre d', because I'm not there in my apron. So they look at me and think, well, there's a black guy in a suit and tie. He must be like the head waiter, or the front of house. And they don't even look at me. They just hold their glass out and say, "Can you fill that up for me, please?" You know? I had a lady walk past my own house cutting my own hedge and saying, would you be able to do mine after you finished that? And I just said, "I don't think you could afford my hourly rate."
So, I mean, you mentioned before about that there is a need for more publicity about people making claims, and that there's so many people that you thought would have applied full compensation that hasn't. How do you think, you have kind of said some stuff about maybe the citizens' advice, but us as a community, how do we get that message out? You know, what are the things that you would like us to hear about how we
what I'm hoping is that if people hear that substantial claims have been paid, they'll realise the scheme is worthwhile. The problem I have with the media is the media that broke the story, predominantly the Independent and the Observer, are very keen to publish bad news stories. And that's because they have a political agenda. They are left of centre publications. This is a Tory government. And they therefore, rather than seeing that the Home Office civil servants as neutral and people who simply facilitate policy, and policy is determined by politicians, they see them as a Tory Home Office. And I actually think that's very unfair upon the Home Office employees, including a number of black employees that work for the Home Office that have contacted me, you know, distressed about their own families and fairness and wanting to make sure the scheme works. So the Home Office is not this kind of monolithic organisation. It's not a Tory conspiracy. I would say that a lot of this occurred under Labour as well. John Reid is an example. Jim Callaghan introduced the 1971 Act in 1968, which was designed to restrict black Commonwealth migration. So I think we were discussing this earlier. There's a kind of passivity about that generation. They're just happy to be here, happy not to be deported, happy not to be detained, happy to go to church, happy to be left alone. No, I want them to be angry, and I want them to think about that suffering, and I want their children, their grandchildren, to encourage them to make claims. If you even got a letter that threatened with deportation and it was then withdrawn, that caused distress. These policies were pursued under Labour and under the Tories because they just want the UKIP vote. They want white British people to find us threatening and to approve of the fact that if we commit a crime, even though you may have been here from the age of 5, that we should go to a country we can't remember. And I'm afraid I just don't agree with that as a policy. I don't think right-thinking British people of any colour, if you explain it to them, agree with it as a policy. So I question, where is the mandate for saying to somebody who came here at 5, commits a crime at 30 with 2 kids under the age of 10, you're a foreign national offender and you can keep in touch with your kids by Skype. But that's the current law, and the law needs changing.
Is there anything you feel that you missed that you want to get across to?
Yeah, there are a few things. I mean, thank you for giving me the opportunity, because I know you've got a big reach. So I want people to have confidence in the scheme. I want them to apply. Nearly over 12,000 people have had their status regularised, which is great. If they've got a biometric card, I'd encourage them to get a British passport. I know it's £91, but we all have to pay that. I suspect a lot of the 12,000 have had their status sorted out have claims. So if we're at 1275, I would be delighted if there was a tenfold increase. I think that people shouldn't be put off by the press coverage, because the press coverage is negative for other reasons. So they'll pick somebody and they'll say X has only been offered 7,000 for being deported. No, they haven't. They've been offered 7,000 for the fact of deportation. And then every day they've been out of the country where they've suffered a loss of benefit or earnings, they will be compensated with that on top, plus the enormous impact of being deported, plus, sorting themselves out when they get back to England. Will they need assistance with housing? If they had secure accommodation, let's get them back into secure accommodation, etc., etc. So it's a hybrid scheme, and it is misrepresented in the press. It's misrepresented by politicians as well because it suits them politically. We have massive, reasonable support from the white British population to get people properly compensated. We just mustn't, be too apathetic to claim, because I want the Home Office to pay top dollar for what they did to my people. And I think the final thing I'd say is, we know about the events in America recently and how tragic they were, and we know a lot about how Black people are perceived in this country. I do hope that successive generations can change that momentum. I hope the legacy of Windrush, apart from compensation, will be that the networks we're making, so the network I'm making with you and Trek and your audience, will continue, because, united, we're so much stronger. I should have known about the very first person that was threatened with deportation before The Independent, before The Guardian, before these white journalists. As a community, we should know, if one of us is attacked, you attack all. And that's the mentality we have to have. This kind of inter-island rivalry, there is no place. Once you're in England, you're just seen as Black. Nobody says there's a Trini, there's a Jamaican, there's a Bajan. You're just a Black, or there's a Nigerian, there's a Ghanaian. They can't even distinguish between the Caribbean and African people. So if they refuse to do so, then we are much stronger if we unite as a migrant community, which can also include the migrant communities from countries with a white Indigenous population, because we can find ourselves equally attacked. I've sat in bars listening to people slating Eastern Europeans in a way I'm sure they slated the Irish and the West Indians 50, 60 years ago. So this is a country which seems to operate on sort of segregation and gradations of status and discrimination. And I was saying to a friend of mine today, isn't it ironic that the guys that turned up to defend Churchill's statue, who were one of them heroically saved by a Black man who I'm full of admiration for, Mr. Hutchinson. I just don't think his white counterpart exists. I mean, the resilience of our people and the compassion is just extraordinary. But that same white working class have been just as oppressed in terms of social mobility for 1,000 years as we have been. And the idea that you find racism within that particular community, who are just as oppressed and downtrodden, despite the colour of their skin, I just find incredibly ironic. I don't quite understand why they can't see that every time a white middle-class politician, we're now finding, Black, Asian middle-class politician joining the Tory party or wherever, is complaining about migration, control of borders, it's a distraction. Because as long as they're in charge and your kids can't get an education, can't rival them for a job, can't get an interview, they're happy. They don't want the status quo to change. So actually, most of us, from more humble backgrounds, have a very common cause, regardless of skin colour. And as long as we are distracted by this kind of interracial rivalry, they sail on quite happily, making lots and lots of money and making sure their kids, inherit their businesses. So I do feel, the major issues in this country are clearly health, education, and infrastructure. And as long as you say to the white working class, well, that would all be fine if you sent all the Black people back. And as long as they're stupid enough to believe in it, it keeps them in their place as well. And so I do think, that's the message that I do think it's about social mobility and class more than race. But we are disproportionately represented at the lowest end of the socioeconomic scale. So therefore, we are more involved in criminality. This is just basic sociology. It doesn't mean as a race, we're more criminal. And we need to change that narrative. And if I can help do that, and I know you are already as a Black historian, then hopefully, in my lifetime, my children will not have to say to my grandchildren, because you're Black or mixed heritage, you're going to have to keep an eye out for the police. You're going to have to mind your P's and Q's. They'll just be able to say, I'm British, I'm truly British, and I'm treated the same as everybody else. So.